Hi, this is Brian Johnson with Finance and Commerce, and I'm pleased to be joined by Kathryn Hoffman, Executive Director of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, which is dedicated to protecting Minnesota's environment, its natural resources, and the health of its people. Kathryn, how you doing today? Good to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me on today.
Thanks for joining me. Well, I'd like to get your perspective on some things. Most importantly, center construction, which is, of course, a hot topic in Minnesota and beyond. But first, I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit more about MCEA and its mission.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is an environmental law nonprofit, and we've been around for 51 years now. We were founded so that the environment would have lawyers representing it and taking care of it and making sure that it's defended in court. And even though that was 51 years ago and the organization has changed and the world has changed, our mission remains the same to use law and science to protect the environment. So anywhere where there's an environmental issue and there's maybe organizations or communities that are concerned and they think a lawyer could be helpful, we're probably their first call. And that means we work on lots of different stuff. We work on water and clean energy. We work on mining. We work on pipelines. And lately, we do a lot of work on data centers.
And tell me, how did you get involved in this line of work, and how long have you been with MCEA?
So I have been with MCEA for 15 years, coming up on 16. I started as an attorney with the organization in 2010 and then became executive director in 2017. I'm a graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School and had spent some time in private practice as well. But when I went to law school, I also did a dual degree with the Humphrey Institute, a master's in environmental policy, because I grew up in Michigan, spent a lot of time. I grew up in the Lower Peninsula, but I spent a lot of time in the UP up along Lake Superior, loved the outdoors. And I've also loved the law. I mean, my dad's a lawyer, so I had some knowledge of it and enjoyed the sort of rigorous thought process and the logic of the law. And so I knew I wanted to sort of combine these things into an environmental law practice. Um, and I started out doing complex litigation with a firm, which was a great job, wonderful people, learned a ton, but not my passion. And so I was very excited to be able to make the jump into environmental law with MCEA a few years into my law practice.
Great. Well, let's just dive right into the A topic here, which of course is data centers. By my read, at least 14 planned data center projects are under construction or proposed in Minnesota. A number of these projects have been tied up in litigation, while some cities such as Eagan, Lakeville, and Minneapolis have enacted moratoriums on new projects. Um, so I wonder, and this caught my attention just when I was looking at your LinkedIn page. Late last year, the MCEA held a webinar called "The Latest on Data Centers in Minnesota: What's Broken and How Can We Fix It?" or how we can fix it. Tell me about that, and what were your, I guess, takeaways from that, and what are your biggest concerns in general about these projects?
Yeah, I mean this data center issue has come up quite quickly, I think both for us in Minnesota, but for a lot of other states as well, really within the last year. And these projects are, these are big hyperscale data centers. So we're not talking about like the servers or smaller computers like on site at an office building, for example. We're talking about out in the suburbs, probably a bunch of land, could be 85, 100 acres made into massive warehouses full of computing equipment. So that's really what we're talking about here. And these are new. There's one under construction in Minnesota that's in Rosemount. And then, as you mentioned, there's a lot more potentially under consideration. And so, as that issue was coming up, we had a couple of concerns. Um, we have some environmental concerns because we've seen problems elsewhere in the country that are a little ahead of us and have more of these. But also, It's not an environmental concern, but I would say it's a concern that's pretty fundamental to democracy and our values in Minnesota. And that's that a lot of these projects are moving forward in secrecy. So what's happening in many communities is the developer and the data center, or excuse me, the developer and the city have signed non-disclosure agreements. And those non-disclosure agreements forbid the city employees from talking publicly about the project, in some cases even from naming that it is a data center. And so these projects, even though it came up suddenly, in some cases the cities had been planning for 6 months or even over a year already with the developer, but the residents didn't know. And that's, I think, a real problem for transparency and democracy. And it eventually becomes an environmental problem because what happened next was many of these cities were going through the environmental study or the environmental review, which is a required step for pretty much any big project in Minnesota. And they were doing so while the non-disclosure agreement was in place. And that meant that a lot of important information about what was being proposed, including whether it's a data center in some cases, how much energy it would use, how much water, are there air pollution concerns, noise, light, other concerns for folks that live nearby? Those things were not being addressed within the environmental study. And from an environmental perspective, the risks or the potential impact of these projects is quite large. These facilities in particular use tremendous amounts of electricity. The Star Tribune has estimated that if 10 of these were built, that would use as much electricity as every household in Minnesota. So we're looking at significant increases in our energy use, and there are big questions about what that means in terms of how we're going to power that. Is it through clean energy, or will it be through fossil fuel use? Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for these new energy sources and then transmission and other related infrastructure? Will that affect your and my electricity bills, or will the data centers pay their way? And what other problems might we be introducing by this level of strain and growth on our grid at a time when we're trying to transition to clean energy? There's also big water questions. These facilities get hot. They need to be cooled. This is oversimplifying a bit, but generally you can cool using air cooling, which uses yet more electricity. So now we're sort of back to the first problem. Or you can use water cooling. Most of these facilities want to use groundwater, and they want to use it from a local municipality. So again, we have questions about who else is using the aquifer and how it might affect the other users. Are we depleting that aquifer faster than we should be? And how sustainable is that? Is there additional infrastructure that needs to be built? Who pays for that? So again, the cost. And then there's also local concerns around noise and light. And so all of these things are things that need to be studied and considered in a transparent process, we believe. And we believe that's what the law requires as well, based on our experience as an environmental law group.
Well, you mentioned the environmental review process and whether it's the form of an EAW or an AUAR. A lot of times they're a lot of times these projects, like you said, they won't mention specifically that it's a data center, but what are some of the code words you might be able to pull from those documents to give you a clue as to what that they might actually be planning a hyperscale data center project?
So sometimes these will be referred to as things like technology park or light industrial development. So terms like that might be clues that it could be a data center. You know, our team found out from stuff that was even harder to find than that. So for example, there are some building codes associated with data centers that we found kind of deep in these documents. So it can be a bit of a challenge, for folks who think that they might have a data center proposal in their town. I mean, I would certainly encourage them to contact us and then also to contact their city and request documents. They're entitled to documents under our Data Practices Act law, which is like our Freedom of Information law here in Minnesota. The non-disclosure agreement doesn't make documents private. They're still public. So even if there is a non-disclosure agreement in place, you can ask for the non-disclosure agreement. You can ask for documents associated with this development. So I definitely encourage people to do that to see if they can find out more if they have something that looks like a big industrial development near them, because that quite possibly could be a data center.
Interesting. How do you think these environmental review processes can be improved, or what would you suggest? What's missing from the process, and how can it be improved?
Yeah. So the gold standard for environmental review in Minnesota is an environmental impact statement. And that's a process that large projects go through in Minnesota. And typically they're projects that there's a specific rule or statute that says this type of project has to do an EIS. So a pipeline has to do an EIS, gas plant, big industrial facilities, even warehouses over 1 million square feet are supposed to be doing EISs. Mines, of course, people followed that in recent years. And so because hyperscale data centers are new to Minnesota, it's less obvious what category this falls into. But the EIS is ideal for something of this size. What's missing from the review right now? I would say three things. One is key information is missing. Second, analysis is missing. And then third, public participation is missing. So let me just say a little bit more about each of those. So in terms of information, I've kind of talked about this, that with the non-disclosure agreement in place, or maybe just out of the city's choice, we don't really know. A lot of it key information, just basic information about what's being proposed, is missing. And it doesn't, they don't include things like how much electricity it would use or how much water it would use, which, as I talked about before, are a big deal. So just basic baseline, what are you building, is often missing. Number two, analysis is missing. So even in the cases where they say, yes, we are building a data center, and they might have some numbers, for example, around, let's take water, that's not enough to make a good environmental study. A good environmental study also includes analysis of what that means. So if let's say that a data center is proposing to take 3 million gallons of water per day for its cooling, that's a number that is useful, but that's not analysis. I mean, what does that mean? And so what aquifer are you pulling from? And what effect is it going to have to take water at that rate? What other cities pull from that aquifer, or people's private wells, or agricultural operations? Who else is using that aquifer? Are we drawing that aquifer down faster than it can replenish? And if so, what does that mean for future use and sustainability? Have we investigated how pulling from that aquifer might affect surface water? Because in Minnesota, everything is connected. Aquifers often support lakes, rivers, and streams as well. And so it might actually have an effect on surface water to draw down an aquifer. So that's analysis as opposed to just information. And then third is public participation. Now, the process that the AUARs that these go through, they do have a public comment period, typically just one. However, the public comment period is not worth much when you haven't really shared what you're building. So at that level, you're missing public participation. An EIS has the advantage of having very robust public participation. In particular, it has 3 comment periods. So there's one at the beginning, which is kind of an open-ended, like, hey, we're thinking about building a data center. What should we be looking for? And it allows people to put in suggestions about what should be studied. It has a second one at the draft. Here's a draft EIS. What are we missing? What else needs to be in here? And then there's one at the final. And so it's robust, and the agency in charge needs to actually look at those and respond. They don't have to do everything the public says, of course, but they need to at least look at it and say, yeah, we considered that and we took these steps, or we don't think that's important and here's why, right? There needs to be a response. An EIS also has the advantage of being done by the state as opposed to a local entity. I personally think it's a little bit unfair to leave cities with the responsibility of analyzing these big projects. I mean, cities don't have the tools necessarily to look at regional water use or statewide energy grid impacts. It makes more sense for cities to analyze something like, local developments, shopping, residential, things like that, where you're mostly looking at things like traffic flow or water runoff. This is a much bigger scale thing with these hyperscale data centers. The state's going to have much more tools to analyze the big impacts of these. So an EIS goes back to the state, and I think it's just makes more sense for the state to have that responsibility because they have more tools and expertise for this level of project.
That's interesting because the EIS, of course, is a tool that's already being used. I think the Viking Stadium was the subject of an EIS, if I'm not mistaken. Some of the bigger projects like that. So we wouldn't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel here, right? It's just taking it to a different level.
Correct. Yeah, this is a known process, and the state agencies have, I mean, we don't do a ton of these, but, two, three a year is typical. And so it's certainly something that they know how to do. By statute, they're supposed to take 280 days. Some of them do take longer for more complex projects. So I can't say for sure that a specific data center can be done in 280 days, but that's the goal. So should take less than a year if it's done according to the statutory guidelines. So it doesn't have to be a multi-year process if it's, they put the resources in. The company needs to pay for it, the project proposer, and so that does help with the resources, right? You're not just relying on the resources the state dedicates to it. They can put the money in and help pay for it. So this is all like kind of established processes. And yes, they would have done one for the Viking Stadium. I'm pretty sure once you go over 20,000 seats in your stadium, you've triggered the EIS mandatory category. And I'm sure there's more than 20,000 seats in US Bank Stadium.
Yeah, and protecting birds was a big concern for that project. I remember writing about that back in the day.
Yeah,
Um,
still an issue, really, as far as I know. They haven't quite figured that one out.
yeah, but I was just doing a little bit of research on, I saw some information from the Green Building Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the built environment's impact on climate. And according to this group, the data center industry continues to work toward sustainability with new technologies and best practices, including the use of more sustainable building materials and construction, exploring alternative energy sources, and embracing innovative cooling solutions. What do you make of that? And do you believe it's possible to build a green hyperscale data center?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much work being done in this area. It's really interesting. And absolutely, like our technology sector in the United States is very innovative. And I feel like these are solvable problems. I mean, I'm not an engineer, so I can't necessarily speak to, what the best outcome would be. Um, but I will say, and I probably sound a little bit like a broken record on the EIS, but one of the advantages of an EIS is that it allows the project proposer to look at alternatives. And so it's perfect for this kind of situation where they can say, okay, we can design the data center with this cooling strategy or that cooling strategy. And people will often ask me, like, is air cooling better or water cooling? Or are we supposed to do something else? And I don't know the answer, but I suspect it depends on the particular facility and the location. Like there might be places where relying more on air cooling is better, might be places where relying on water cooling is better. And laying it out in these alternatives allows us to kind of see it side by side and see the pros and cons of each strategy. And even though well, and frankly, what it does is it tends to push the project proposer towards the environmentally best option, right? Because once you see it that way, you say, well, and the state wants to do that, or the city would probably want to do that as well once they see the alternatives. And so you often hear, and so that there's those alternatives are good. And the other thing I want to say about it is that The reality is that, companies have a bottom line, right? They have shareholders that they're beholden to, and they will often, the companies themselves may tend towards the less expensive option. And so if we really want to push these environmental and innovative solutions, which I think we do, like we want to push that here in Minnesota, we do need regulatory guidelines in place to do that. We can't really rely on companies to simply do that voluntarily. There isn't a lot of incentive. You hear these stories about data centers with innovative design. So, for example, like in Scandinavian countries, there's a heavy reliance on geothermal. They're doing a good job in some of those countries making use of the waste heat. So, these things need to be cooled, and there's a lot of waste heat. That waste heat is actually a resource, like it could be used for something. For example, at a nearby building that needs heating or an industrial facility that needs heat nearby, right? Like there's ways to make use of that. That's not something we're really looking at least in Minnesota. They're not citing them with that in mind. They're looking at, where's the land cheap, and maybe they're looking at where some of the electricity infrastructure is, but they're not necessarily looking at how do we use this waste heat. And so, like those kinds of cool, innovative ideas are going to have to come from, be driven somewhat by a regulatory strategy. And that's why, we've been doing a fair amount of work at the legislature to try to bring some more laws into place, because that's putting some constraints on it is really how you get better design and more innovation.
Interesting. Did you have any hearings or anything of that sort at the legislature this year on this topic?
Yes, we did. So there was a bill that would ban non-disclosure agreements at the city level, and that did get hearings. I want to say it for sure in the Senate. I mean, it passed in the Senate. And so it passed, off the floor. I It did get a hearing in the House, but did not eventually. I think it was referred to another committee and kind of died there. And then we did get bills introduced, but they didn't get hearings before deadline on the mandatory EIS, permitting, a moratorium bill that would we say moratorium, but it's really a pause, like a pause for while we do some studies to try to get these guide rails in place. So it's a funded study with a pause. As well as a large water bill that would put some regulatory guidelines around if they want to pull a lot of water from the aquifer or from a municipal source. They have to get their own permit and some sustainability requirements for that. So those bills were all introduced, but after some of them got hearings, but none of them passed. And it was tough here at the legislature. So we all know it's pretty divided. So we'll keep all that ready for next year. And in the meantime, we hope that we do some of the litigation will help improve some of the environmental studies and opportunities for public participation.
Hmm. We'll keep an eye on that for sure. Catherine, well, we've covered a lot of ground here on data centers, and is there anything else you'd like to mention before we close here? I want to be respectful of your time, but I also want to give you the last word. So if you have any parting thoughts.
Well, thanks, Brian. I mean, what I want to say to your listeners is to speak up, that their voice matters. If you have questions about what's happening in your town, go to your city council meetings. People are showing up at local governance hearings at high rates around these issues because they're concerned. But this is good for local democracy when people show up, and we want better processes that we have. So use your voice. I think it's a common experience that people are having across the country that it feels like sometimes local folks are being kept out of the conversation a little bit, and we want to change that. Like we want people to speak up, and you'd be surprised at how much impact you could have showing up at these local meetings. You have more power than you think.
Well, great. Well, thank you for that, Catherine. Thank you for your time. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Have a good day.
You too.